Hey everybody, so today we're going to be talking about the heart, cardiac cycle. So first, let's talk a little bit about the heart. So obviously we have our heart here, and we have several different distinguishing landmarks. So first of all, we've got our inferior and superior vena cava. We've got our right atria, our left atria, our right ventricle, our left ventricle. We've got our tricuspid and bicuspid or mitral valve. Then we have our pulmonary arteries and veins coming out of there. And we have our interventricular septum in the middle. And then we've got our pulmonary semilunar valve and our aortic semilunar valve going into the aorta and off to the rest of the body. So first of all, we have our SA node, which is where all the magic happens, and we get all of our original signals being sent. And that comes down and activates the AV node, which then in turn activates the bundle branches. And these bundle branches come down the interventricular septum, and then they branch up the side of the heart, and these are called Purkinje fibers. So there's several different sections of our heart. We have our endocardium, which is the inside lining of the heart. We have our myocardium, which is the muscle middle part, and then our epicardium, which is the outside layer. So, first of all, we have two different types of cells within our heart. We have the autorhythmic and the cardiomyocytes. The autorhythmic cells are the SA, AV, and bundle branches and Purkinje fibers. They control all of that, and they happen automatically. Surprise, surprise. The cardiomyocytes are the rest of these. So these stimulate these. So let's go over some of what they are. Okay, so first of all, here's our cell. And just like all of our other cells, we have our SR containing calcium in the inside, which requires your ryanodine receptor to be opened, and then calcium can come out and stimulate contraction, and you've got your circuit pumps. But here's how these differ from all of our other muscles. So for your autorhythmic, you have HCN, which are funny channels, and what happens is they open up and you can have all these positive cation channels that come in. And these come and stimulate L and T type voltage gated calcium channels. And all of this calcium coming in is bringing in a lot of positive charges, which then come down, and like we learned in our last section, they come and they open that ryanodine receptor. Okay, now over here, we've got our NCX channel, which allows in 3 sodiums and it kicks out calcium. Now this is important to maintain the balance within our cell. We have one more channel, and that's the GERK channel, which is a G protein potassium channel. So it allows it allows potassium to come out of the cell. And this is an M2 receptor, and so ACH release is regulated by this M2 receptor. So this, the HCN funny channel is forgive me, we're gonna fix that. When it hyperpolarizes the cell, letting all of this come in, we have CAMP, and then CAMP comes and it opens this. So okay, next we have our cardiomyocyte. So once again, we have our SR and all of this magic happening down here, except this time we don't have an HCN channel, we have an I sodium channel. And we have a bunch of these, and then we've got a bunch of voltage-gated calcium L and T-type channels. And so this allows all of these calcium and sodium in, which sends that positive charge down, allowing this whole process to happen like we've talked about before. And those get stimulated by, since these two are connected, what happens is an action potential comes in, and then that opens all of those. So now we come over here, we still have our NCX channel that is helping maintain our gradient. And then down here we have some different channels. So first of all, we're going to start with our IK1 channel, and it's at the bottom of the food chain. It opens when the cell is hyperpolarized. And then we work our way up. So then we have our IKS, which stands for slow, and then we have our IKR, which stands for rapid. And then we have our IKUR, which is ultra rapid. And then we have our ITO chloride channel, and that is transient. So that goes all the way across. So when we come over here to what's happening with our action potential, when things start rushing out of this, we get this divot here, and it's going to go from one to the next. So, okay, let's come back up to here. We're going to start comparing these action potentials and what they look like. So with an autorhythmic cell, you start at -60 is your resting membrane potential, and an IF channel opens, and that's going to be our step 4, and it causes your action potential to depolarize, and you come up, and then a calcium channel is open. So the calcium channel opens, you reach the apex of your curve, and then the IK channels and your GERK channels open, allowing all of that potassium to come out, which then hyperpolarizes the cell. And then you start the whole process again. Now, for your cardiomyocytes, what happens is you're starting at -90 this time, and you are going to come up, and your sodium channel is going to open, causing the depolarization. And then you get to the top, and you have your your IK chloride channel, or ITO chloride channel, excuse me. And that opens, allowing the negatives to come out of the cell. So you're going to have hyperpolarization. And then in this plateau area, you've got your calcium channels opening up, and then in order you have all of your IK blah 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 channels opening up, allowing this rush of all of the charges, and that is going to then allow your cell to more fully hyperpolarize. So then at the very end, you have your IK1 channels that are still open during this, so that you don't go beyond that. And then you start the whole process over again. So next on our list of things to cover, we need to go over what is actually happening inside the heart when this is taking place. So we have our EKGs. This is what a normal EKG looks like. You've got your P wave, your Q wave, your R, S, and T. So P wave is atrial contraction. So your atriums or atria are contracting. And then your Q wave is depolarization of a specific section. So what depolarizes first is a little section on the left ventricle, like in the left ventricle on the interventricular septum. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. So R is then when this all depolarizes really quickly and causing contraction, and so you contract your ventricles, and that kind of happens in like plume fashion. And then complete depolarization of the heart is the S, so that's going to be our lowest. So the whole thing is depolarized. And then T is where the magic happens, and you make this whole thing hyperpolarize or repolarize, again starting at the apex, working its way up. So for example, over here we're going to pretend this is our heart. We have the different ventricles and the different atria. So what happens is P wave, you start out, this is going to be for, I just did the wrong color. R is for positive and blue is for negative. So if we have all of these are positives because your cells are all in resting state. And then what happens is the signal starts. So this starts, and it's going to work its way down. So that's going to cause this to go up because the overall charge, you're having positives next to a positive, causing it to go upward. Okay, now what happens is you have completely come in and depolarized everything. So we're just not going to even waste our time anymore with that. And that's all negative. Okay, so Q wave. So now you've got things propagating down. So not only do you have your bundle branches that come down or sending signals, hey, you need to depolarize, get with the crew, get with the plan, but you've got this special tricky little weird thing that is doing its own thing, and it starts to depolarize first. So you have depolarization coming in that direction as well. Okay, so R wave, what happens is you are taking, this is now all going to be negative, and this then becomes negative, and then it works its way up and becomes negative, and it's working all of this around. And then, so your S wave, you now are all depolarized, no positive. And then T wave, you start to turn positive again from there up. So hopefully that makes a little more sense. And here you can see each of those waves as they take place. So a little bit of extra information, end-STEMI and STEMI, what is going on in both of those. So end-STEMI, you have some of the endocardial cells in the heart, not a lot, but just a section that are depolarized when they're not supposed to, causing them to send action potentials out and depolarization from that area of the heart when they're not supposed to be. And so what this does is this raises our resting membrane potential, and yet when you come back down with the S phase, it goes all the way back down to where you were originally, and then back up to the new resting membrane potential. STEMI, what happens is you've depolarized and broken entirely through the entire wall of the heart. And so it changes the direction that you're depolarizing, because you can't depolarize out towards nothing. And so that's going to cause you to go down, because it's a negative going to a positive in the upward fashion. And so that drops you down for that. So hope you enjoyed. See you next time.
Hello, hello, hello. Okay, so for this video, we're going to be talking about several different things. First of all, we're going to start out with the explanation of what inotropy and chronotropy are. So inotropy is referring to contractibility within the heart. Chronotropy is the rate of that contraction, so pretty well heart rate. And then there's positives and negatives to chronotropy, and we're going to go over that in just a minute. So, but first of all, we need to know two things. Inotropic means that you've increased the force of the contraction, and lusitropic is when you've decreased the force of contraction. And there's different things that cause these effects. So we are going to jump actually to my book, because I have it written out all nice. Okay, here is the graph I was referring to. So we start out with stimulating the beta-1 adrenergic receptor, and this in turn activates the alpha receptor. Okay, so this then has two pathways, so we're going to follow this one over here. What it does is the interaction of the alpha subunit with the L-type calcium channels then stimulates the opening of calcium channels. Then this lets in the calcium, and then the calcium induced release from the SR, because we know that whole pathway through the different muscles that we learned previously. And then this increases contractibility or inotropic effect. Okay, so the other pathway is a little bit more complicated. So the activated alpha subunit increases adenylyl cyclase, which then increases CAMP, which then increases protein kinase A. And that has this whole effect. So we're going to start and head that way. So first of all, we have phosphorylation of L-type calcium channels. So these get phosphorylated or turned on, which then increases the opening of calcium channels, which then you get calcium influx, and then you have your whole process of it being released, and then increasing contractibility or inotropic effect. Phosphorylation of ryanodine receptor, that's the one that lets the calcium out, or it's the one that has what's that word? Conformational shift to open up the calcium channel from the SR. So anyways, dislocation of calstabin 2 from the ryanodine receptor. It opens the ryanodine receptor, calcium is released by the SR, and then that's an increase of calcium, so you increase your contractibility or inotropic effect again. Okay, now this one is phosphorylation of phospholambdin. This increases the amount of circupumps that are opening on the SR that allow calcium to be reuptaken. So, like it says right here, you increase calcium reuptake in the SR, and that increases the calcium stores, which then has another two pathways. So you can either go back down this process, or it can speed up the relaxation phase because you've sucked up those calciums that much faster. So that's a lusotropic effect, or a decrease in contraction duration. Then you have phosphorylation of troponin 1. And this increases the off rate of calcium from troponin C in our myosin head, contract, that whole thing. And then this increases the speed of relaxation, which we just said was a lusotropic effect, decreasing the duration of contractibility. So we have increase, 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 decrease, decrease. And we're back to the board. So we are going to talk about how acetylcholine, actually first, but then we'll come back to this. But anyways, acetylcholine, what happens with it? So it's a muscarinic type 2 receptor. So what happens is it stimulates 3 different things. So let's start with the first one. It stimulates a beta gamma heterodimer, which then opens the GERK channels. And the GERK channels are opened in response to the funny channels in the cardiomyocytes. And so then what happens is your what they're called is G protein activated inward rectifying calcium channels. So then they help the cell come back to equilibrium. Anyways, and then that causes membrane potential to be more negative, and this decreases the heart rate. Our next one is the alpha subunit. Well, the next 2 are the alpha subunits, but anyways, they both are going to decrease CAMP, and then the decrease in CAMP does 2 things. It decreases the IF, and it decreases the I calcium. So these 2 things, so the IF flattens the slope, and then the I calcium makes the threshold more positive. So these both then in turn decrease the heart rate. Okay, for norepinephrine and epinephrine, they bind to beta-1 receptors, which we just learned about in that list of what goes down. Anyways, they follow the pathway of sympathetic stimulation. Okay, last thing really quick, we have got a cell, and we're going to talk about how calcium affects it. So like we learned previously when we were talking about muscles, and the heart is a muscle, the action potential comes down, and it comes and it opens the sodium channel. The sodium channel opens and comes and turns on the calcium channel. Calcium comes in and floods the cell, and there's many, these dashes are all to show calcium channels. Anyways, it comes in making the cell more positive. This positive charge comes and presses on the ryanodine receptor. This causes a conformational shift, pushing on another, and that's connected to the SR. And the SR contains more calcium, and so this causes the calcium to rush into the cell, and we have pressure pushing this direction so it doesn't go out of the cell. And then that calcium comes down, it binds, and we have our whole muscle contraction that we've talked about. Once the contraction is done and our calcium's been used, it pops off and it gets reuptaken in our circupumps that are driven by ATP. And so the cycle just keeps on going.
Hey, so today we're going to be talking about pressure and lots of different cool things. So first of all, we need to know a few things. So the ventricle holds 120 milliliters. When the ventricle contracts, we lose about 70 milliliters, leaving us with 50 milliliters in the ventricle after contraction, so when it's at rest. Okay, so now we're going to jump down to here, and we're going to go through our lub-dub sounds that you hear about all the time. So you've got your left arterial pressure, and that comes along, and you get your bump, bump, and then straight, and then bump. You've got your left ventricular pressure, which instead of following this entirely, it follows the first bump, and then it goes way up, comes back down, then little bump. So that's showing the contraction right here. So S1, or this point right here, is your lub sound, and that's the mitral valve closing. Well, it's actually both AV valves closing, but we're just focusing on it. The only one that really matters is the mitral valve closing. So there's your lub. Now, you're gonna have also your aortic pressure, and that is this purple line right here. So as you are contracting, what happens is you come back down after your contraction, but with your aortic pressure, what happens is we have what's called a dicrotic notch. And so your blood rushes up through the semilunar valve, the aortic semilunar valve, into the aorta. And it kind of like jumps back a little bit. It's kind of like a hello, here we are. Okay, actual blood flow. And so that pressure is caused by how much blood is pushing against that valve. So this is going to be our dub sound. So the closing of the semilunar valve is your dub. Okay, so now we're going to jump down to here. And this graph shows us our EDV, or end diastolic volume. And so this is volume and this is time. And so the volume, you come up and then you have this little tiny plateau, and this is your isovolumic, or the same volume contraction. You're keeping the same volume for that little section. And then it drops way down, and then it comes back up, and then anyways comes down, and then we go back into the cycle. But this is our ESV, and you can see that that's our second little plateau area. So we're gonna jump, well, actually we're gonna talk about lub dub first. So like we said, lub is mitral valve closing, dub is the aortic semilunar valve. So if we have a lub sh dub, then that means that our aortic valve has a murmur. So we're getting our lub, and then the sh is this the thing we don't want to hear. So lub sh dot 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 dub, that means that the dub's fine, but we're having a problem with this lub. So we know that something's wrong with the mitral valve. Now if we have lub sh dub, that's a little different. So that indicates that we've got aortic stenosis. So here's our ventricle, the blood comes through, it comes to come up through that aortic valve, comes up, and stenosis means to narrow, and so we've got a narrowing of our aorta. So it comes up, and it's like, whoa, there's not as much room here, we don't like being crowded. Anyways, and it freaks out, and then it goes about its business. So that's the sh before the dub. Okay, then we have lub, dub, and then shush after. And that indicates that something's wrong with this actual valve, the semilunar aortic valve. Okay, so now cardiac output. That is very important because we need to know how much our heart is pumping out. So that's determined by two things. That's determined by heart rate and stroke volume. So heart rate, we know, is how fast the heart is contracting. Stroke volume is EDV minus ESV, or end diastolic volume minus end systolic. So diastolic is contraction and systolic is at rest. So that's where you get your blood pressure from, like your 180 over 90. Anyways, okay, so this, we have another equation as well. So E equals the stiffness of the heart, and that can be determined by the change in pressure over the change in volume. Okie dokie, let's come over here. So we got another graph, lots of graphs today, and we're going to be doing pressure and volume. So this is how we determine how we're going to treat patients. What is it going to actually solve the problem? So first of all, we need to know some terms. So inotropy is kind of synonymous with inotropic, and inotropic is asking about the contraction of the heart. So it's asking about, is there more calcium? Is it stiff? Is it floppy? So really it's asking how much of like the amount of volume moved per unit of pressure. And then you've got isovolumic, which is, it means the same volume per pressure. So they kind of are talking about the same thing somewhat. Okay, so we've got our values. So where we're going to start is preload, which is asking us how much volume is being held in that left ventricle before it contracts. So then we have our lub that we just talked about. So our mitral valve closes, and that gives us our preload of how far it's going to be. So then we have our isovolumic contraction, and then we have our opening of the semilunar valves. And this is where we start determining what's called afterload, or how high this way it's going to be. And then you have relaxation of the ventricle. So the different things that can be determined by these are the stroke volume, so how much the volume actually is. And then right here we had our dub, or our closing of the semilunar valves, which caused that relaxation. And so this is going to be our max pressure. So then we have this line coming through here, and this stands for inotropic. So this is asking us how much pressure does it take to move the amount of volume that we're discussing. Okay, so now we're going to bounce back up to here. MAP stands for the mean arterial pressure. So we're talking about pressure and then just all of the blood systems, so arteries, veins, venules, capillaries, all of that good stuff. So we have 120 over 80, so that's, once again, we're talking blood pressure, so diastolic over systolic. And you can see that our top pressure that we have, or that contraction, is where we get our diastolic, and our systolic is that low. So it goes, and then it starts to peter out on that. So there's some different calculations that we need to be able to make in reference to the mean arterial pressure. So mean arterial pressure is DBP plus 1/3 of the SBP minus the DBP. Or it's cardiac output, which we already figured out how to do, times PR, which is pressure resistance. So how much resistance is in the artery. So this PR can then be determined by 8 times the viscosity times the length divided by pi times r to the 4th. So this is where we can majorly regulate how that's going to change and apply to all the other systems. So we change that number either with smooth muscle, we change the radius, which, contract or dilate, and this is what causes our largest impact when we're changing different variables. So one more thing really quick. We're going to talk about baroreceptors and how does our body know that, hey, we've got a problem, we need to change these different variables. So you have baroreceptors in the aortic arch, and what happens, and in all of your different arteries and everything, is they sense a change and they go, oh, hey, we got a situation here. And so they send back that information to the midbrain, and that's where we get stimulation of either the SNS or the PNS, so fight or flight. And then, so if you are stimulating the SNS or the sympathetic, it's saying, fight, this is a problem, we need to get blood to our legs and our arms so that we can fight. We're going to divert it away from our organs. And so for that, it would cause vasoconstriction because we're trying to increase our heart rate and our blood pressure to get us moving and fighting. Whereas with PNS, what would happen is you're going to decrease, or you're going to vasodilate so that you chill out and to digest your food. Anyways, okay, so yeah, it affects our blood pressure, and we'll see you in the next video.
Hello! Okay, so we are going to talk about capillary exchange, which is pretty dang awesome. So, as you can see, we have got a blood vessel, shown as so. At the front of our blood vessel, we have the precapillary sphincter. And in order to open this sphincter, we either need to have potassium, ADP, CO2, or hydrogen to open that up. And this is what protects our capillaries, because we've got our arterial end and then our venous end over here on this side. This is a sensitive area, and so if you, I guess we're just gonna jump right over here. If you have too much pressure going through here, it's gonna blow it up and it's gonna shred this inside area, and that is also known as a reperfusion injury, which is the rapid increase in metabolites causing cellular damage, which can then lead to stroke or myocardial infarction. So we definitely don't want that. So we're going to go through the different parts of what's actually going on here. So shown in green, we have our lymphatic vessels. Now these have a -3 IFP, or excuse me, they just have a 3 IFP. That was meant to be a dot. And what happens is that they are constantly always sucking out little bits and pieces from this area, and they have a valve that is pointed inward, so stuff can come up through it, but it can't come back out of it. Okie dokie, so next we have HP, which is also known as our hydrostatic pressure, and this is how much pressure is normally inside the blood vessel. So on the arterial end, we start at an HP of 30 millimeters of mercury, and then as we come to this venous end, it becomes 10, which is a pretty decent change, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. So inside here we have what's called albumin, and this is what drives the BCOP, or the blood colloid osmotic pressure, because we know that water goes to where the stuff is. So this is going to cause 28 millimeters of mercury to want to come in to the blood vessel. And as shown here, we've got our mast cell, and then we've got our histamine that is released during this process. So the next one on our list is ICOP. ICOP is the interstitial colloid osmotic pressure, and that is what the pressure is on the outside in the interstitial space, which is outside of that blood vessel. So an important thing to note is that blood is shunted to work where you are working. Okay, so at 30 at the arterial end that we've been talking about, we're getting 28 in through our BCOP, and then out we've got 3 different variables. We've got hydrostatic pressure, so 30, and then ICOP 8, and then IFP 3 from our lymphatic vessels. So 28 and the 41, so 41 minus 28 is 13 overall that's coming out. That's our net effect. And then on our venous end, we have our in and out, and once again the BCOP is 28, it stays. But this time our HP, or hydrostatic pressure, is 3, our ICOP is 8, and then we've got our IFP, which is 3, leaving us 21. So now our net effect is 7 going into our blood vessel. So we're going to talk about a few more things. So what is edema? Edema is when fluid fills the interstitial space and causes swelling. So there's 4 different types. We have hydrostatic edema, permeability edema, lymph edema, and osmotic edema. So hydrostatic is the increase in extrastitial fluid leading to the increase in hydrostatic pressure. So since we've increased the extrastitial fluid, then that HP increases. Permeability is the macromolecules cross the capillary endothelial cell membrane, which then increases the ICOP, and water goes to the molecules. So we get macromolecules that come in here, they bust this all up, making it so all of our molecules are on the outside and water goes to where the molecules are, so it comes out causing edema. Okay, lymph, so lymphedema is where the lymph vessels are damaged. So if these are damaged, then they're not going to be able to suck as much fluid out of that space. And then osmotic is where plasma is diluted, which this is a very fragile equilibrium, and so when the plasma is diluted, it throws off the osmolarity, and like we keep saying, water goes to the molecules, so you gotta be really careful with that. So local control is really important because when we're talking about local control, we're talking about what's going on in an area of the blood vessel, and this can be caused to, this, how do I put this? This scenario can be caused by many different things, like a puncture wound, any fight or flight scenarios. So you've got two different types. You've got myogenic and you've got paracrine. So let's start with myogenic. Myogenic has to do with the smooth muscles contracting around the artery. This causes them to stretch, and then that releases, it causes calcium to be released, and then it enters the cell. And then you have vasoconstriction, and then that increases the blood pressure and the resistance. And as we've talked about in other sections, we know what that then does. With paracrine, however, endothelial cells are what we're really working with, and these release paracrines, and then the increased paracrine release then increases metabolic activity, and this increased metabolic activity decreases local CO2 levels. This then causes vasodilation, which then causes increased blood flow because your body's freaking out that you're not getting enough oxygen. So it's like, vasodilate. And then our blood flow increases. So anyways, and then this in turn, once again, increases metabolic activity. So these two kind of cause this scenario to go on and on. Anyways, this is called active hyperemia. Okie dokie. Oh, we've got one more little thing. So there's two different things we need to discuss: inflammation and clotting cascade. So inflammation, there's going to be two of these hormones or molecules or whatever we want to call these that have to do with inflammation. These are bradykinin and histamine, and these are both histamines. And then our clotting cascade has serotonin and ADP, which are both vasoconstrictors. So there's that quick little recap.
Hey, so today we're going to be talking about blood composition and platelets and all sorts of fun and exciting things. So let's start with what makes up our blood. So we're going to say this is our vial of blood. The very top layer is going to be plasma, and it's 55% of our blood. Then you have this thin layer called the buffy coat, and it contains all of our white blood cells and platelets. And then last but not least, we have our very last one, which is the hematocrit, which contains all of our red blood cells. And that consists of 40 to 45% of our blood. So let's talk about each of these levels a little bit more. So we got plasma, and 92% of our plasma is just water. And the rest is made up of colloids. And the three top colloids that we're going to talk about are albumin, globulins, and fibrinogens. So albumin is the most common. It's 60% of those colloids. And it's responsible for BCOP, or blood colloid osmotic pressure, that we're going to talk about a little bit later. And it's a transport vehicle to transport other important things. And then we've got globulins, which are the second most abundant, and these are antibodies, which are super important. And then our fibrinogens are our clotting factors. So blood without clotting factor is called serum. Okie dokie. So we're going to come up to our graph over here, and we're going to say that this side is positive and this side is negative, so it's going to attract, the opposites attract. So our albumin is going to be the most negative of our colloids, vice versa. IgS, or the globulins, are going to be our most positive. And that is represented with gamma, and then fibrin is beta, and then we have our alpha. Okay, so did you know that women have a lower hematocrit than men because of estrogen? Testosterone increases that hematocrit, so theirs is always going to be a little bit lower. Now we're going to talk about erythropoietin, or EPO. And this, what happens is the kidney senses low oxygen, and it increases or releases this EPO. And then this EPO then goes to the bone marrow, which then stimulates stem cells to make more red blood cells and increase that hematocrit. So we are going to jump over here now. So this is a regular red blood cell, and within these red blood cells we have these alpha helixes, which is our hemoglobin. And there's going to be an alpha and a beta end, and then vice versa, beta and an alpha end. And you blow up one of these parts, the helix, And this is what it's going to look like bigger, and it's going to have the heme group inside it. And you blow that up, and that's where you can actually see what's going on. So the nitrogens all turn inward and are attracted to Fe. So did you know that there's 1 billion hemes in every red blood cell, and they can't be recycled? So we've got a lot going on in just one little red blood cell. Now, something important to know is that as your blood cells get older and they are cycled throughout your system, they get dings in them, kind of like an old car. They get dented and they're not their original shape, which would be represented by these two. And so what happens is the macrophages come in and they eat these old blood cells, and that all takes place in the spleen. So that's why your spleen is so important. Oh, and also hemoglobins, they each can hold 4 oxygens, which oxygen is very important to all functions of life, and so that is very important. Okay, now down here, so our heme that we had right there, what happens is heme gets oxygenated and it turns into biliverdin. And then what happens is biliverdin reductase comes in and turns it into bilirubin. Biliverdin is a blue-green color, whereas bilirubin is more of a yellow color. So then that goes to your blood, and that's where you get your albumin that's so important. And then that goes to your liver, and your liver releases glucuronic acid onto the bilirubin, which glucuronic acid is a type of sugar, and it makes the bilirubin soluble so that things can come in. So this is going on in your bile duct, goes through the bile duct, and then the bacteria in your gut eat the glucuronic acid, which then turns it into urobilinogen, which is the sugarless form of our glucuronic acid, or bilirubin. And then we have 2 options that we can go. So 50% is converted to sterobilin, which is going to turn into your poo-poo. And then 50% on the other side is going to go back to your blood, which then goes to your kidneys, which then turns into urobilin, which you know what that is? Your pee-pee. So, and that's going to be yellow. So, that's kind of the process that this takes. Now we're going to jump over here to, we're inside the blood vessel now. And we're going to ignore this because Katie screwed up, but we're jumping to this. So, first of all, this is your blood vessel, and you've got epithelial cells lining the inside. And then you've got your basement layer on the outside. So, epithelial cells are super important because they release what's called Van Willebrand factor, and we'll come to that in just a second. But first of all, we have the key player today is going to be platelets. And the platelets have GP1B, or von Willebrand factor receptors, on these platelets, and these are inactivated at this point. So what happens is you get a cut, abrasion, and your blood vessel has a puncture or a hole in it, and that's depicted here. And what happens is your von Willebrand factor comes in and it lines that, and it says like, hello, I'm here, come save me. And so then the platelets come in and they come and they attach, which causes them to be activated and change shape into this wonky formation. And inside we have different types of granules. So you have dense granules, which ADP and calcium. And then you have alpha granules, which is PDGF, or platelet-derived growth hormone. And then it creates your, what we're going to talk about a little bit later, but 5 and then our 8. And okay, we're almost there. So thromboxane, TXA2 is also in there. And then these little black lines in between, those are fibrin, which we're going to talk about. They connect all of these von Willebrand factor receptors together. And the von Willebrand factor receptors are always on the pseudopodia that come out at the very tip so that they can grab hands and interlock. What happens is all these platelets grab hands and they create this great big group that nothing can get through, and that's our platelet plug. So it comes in here and it plugs this up so that you don't bleed out, which is flippin' awesome. So now we have another way that we can prevent us from bleeding out. God makes lots of ways to protect us because we are stupid sometimes. So we have our intrinsic and our extrinsic pathway. So intrinsic pathway, is going to have a negative charge, and then what happens past that, you have these are your factors. So you have factor 12 that turns into factor 12a, and then you have factor 11, which turns into 11a, and then you randomly have factor 9, which is stupid, and it turns into 9a. And what you have to have is, in order to make the next step happen, you have to have an additional 8 come in. And we just talked about 8 because 8, it comes from those alpha granules. So there's your 8, and then that activates 10, which why it's after 9 is additionally really stupid. But then you have 10 to 10a, and then you have to add that factor 5, which, hey, again, alpha granules. And then that activates the second one. Now, second one is really important because this is prothrombin. And when you turn that into 2a, it becomes thrombin, which we like to talk about a lot. And then that activates 1, which is fibrinogen, and then that turns into 1a, or fibrin, which comes and connects these all together. But in order for that to happen, you also have to have factor 8. That's not factor 8, that's factor 13, excuse me. Okay, so this is a process that is called the cascade, and it's called a cascade for a reason, because once you start this, it makes the others all take place. And it's like the flu, it just spreads. One person spreads it to another 10 people, and those 10 people keep spreading it. So if you want to stop this cascade from taking place, the most effective way to do that is to cut the snake off, or the head of the snake off at the very top. You want to take care of factor 12 and stop that from taking place, because if you were to stop one of these other factors, these ones are still going to take place, and they're going to cascade in other directions, and you're still going to have clotting. So we also have our extrinsic pathway, which what happens is you have these cells that release factor 3. And factor 3 releases factor 7, which turns into 7a, and then that stimulates 10 to 10a, and then we're back down here. So intrinsic is you're intrinsically sensing a problem and you're fixing it intrinsically. Extrinsically is you're sensing the problem on the outside and also trying to fix it from the outside. So this is all taking place at the same time, trying to make sure that you don't bleed out and protect you. So there's several things that we need to know. We have 2 drugs. There is warfarin, which is also known as Coumadin, and it blocks vitamin K, which vitamin K is necessary to make this factor 7. And this happens in the liver. So if you want to turn off the whole extrinsic pathway, that's the way to go. Heparin blocks factor 12, which is this whole intrinsic pathway, really important. So those are our 2 big drivers of making big changes. Okay, so a few extra things that we need to know. So the liver makes a lot of fibrinogen, which then becomes fibrin, which gives us those ropes to connect and make our clotting. Calcium is necessary to activate the platelets, which in order to create that plug, they have to be activated. And then thromboxane binds G protein on platelets and activates them, which this process is inhibited by aspirin, making them lipid soluble, so they can't do their job. Okay, so really quickly, plasminogen is what turns into plasmin, and plasmin is super important because it comes in and it breaks apart the fibrin so it can be recycled. So once you've clotted up and you've got kind of your crusty forming on the outside, healing your cut, then you don't want that to stay there forever, and some of us pick them off quicker than it can do its job because we're rude like that. So what happens is this plasmin comes in and it breaks those up so your body can reuse those nutrients. In order for this to take place, you have to have TPA and you have to have urokinase come in, hit that plasminogen, turning it into plasmin. Okay, so we have 3 different types of homeostasis. So we have vasoconstriction, platelets, and coagulation. So vasoconstriction, if you're bleeding out, is super, super important because you want to stop that blood. If you chop off your leg and it's squirting blood, you want to be able to clamp down and stop blood from going to that area. And that's why they tourniquet. Well, this is very similar. So vasoconstriction is what starts this process. So it comes in and it constricts the blood vessel saying, hey, we're leaking, we gotta stop.
and sometimes it can clamp it down completely. But that way you have less blood flow going to that area, causing a problem and squirting out all the holes. So next you have your platelets, which is this whole situation. They want to come in, you want a platelet plug, you need to plug the hole. And then you also need to be creating these different factors, which is the coagulation. So not only are your platelets coming in from the buffy coat, but you also have all of these factors taking place to plug the hole and stop you from bleeding out. So it's a pretty amazing system. We'll see you next time.